The lightning struck the communications tower at 0347 hours, sending a cascade of sparks into the pre-dawn darkness like deadly fireworks. Lieutenant Jessica Morgan pressed herself against the concrete wall of the meteorological station as the thunder crashed overhead, so close it seemed to shake the very foundations of forward operating base Sentinel. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her weather monitoring equipment screamed warnings in electronic harmony, barometric pressure dropping faster than a stone, wind speeds climbing past 60 knots. The storm cell that had appeared on her radar 3 hours ago was now directly overhead, and it was unlike anything she'd seen in her 18 months. Deployed to the high desert of Afghanistan. The radio crackled with static and panicked voices. Weather station, this is Tower Control. We need an immediate atmospheric conditions report. Medevac helicopter is requesting emergency landing clearance. Jessica grabbed her headset, her fingers moving across the array of instruments that filled the cramped meteorological station. Temperature, humidity, wind direction, atmospheric pressure, electromagnetic interference readings. The data painted a picture that made her stomach clench with professional concern. Tower Control, this is Met Station. Negative on helicopter operations. We have severe electromagnetic anomalies, wind shear exceeding operational limits, and lightning activity directly over the LZ. Recommend holding pattern at minimum safe distance. Weather station, that bird has 2 critical patients on board. We need options, not excuses. Jessica stared at her screens, analyzing the storm's movement patterns with the intensity of a surgeon examining X-rays. The meteorological data wasn't just showing a routine desert thunderstorm. The electromagnetic signatures, the pressure differentials, the way the storm cell was maintaining coherence despite the terrain, something was fundamentally wrong with this weather system. Tower Control, recommend diversion to Kandahar. This storm system shows anomalous characteristics that make flight operations extremely hazardous. Anomalous characteristics? It's a thunderstorm, Lieutenant. Give us wind speed and direction, not science fiction. The dismissive tone in the air traffic controller's voice was familiar. Jessica had heard variations of it from every male officer on the base since her arrival. She wasn't a pilot, she wasn't infantry, she wasn't special operations. She was just the weather girl, the atmospheric technician who provided routine forecasts for flight operations and mission planning. Never mind that she'd graduated, summa cum laude, from the Air Force Academy with a degree in atmospheric physics. Never mind that she'd completed advanced training in meteorological warfare and environmental intelligence analysis. Never mind that she could read weather patterns like other people read newspapers. To them, she was just Lieutenant Morgan, the woman who told them if they needed sunscreen or rain gear. The medevac helicopter attempted its approach anyway. Jessica watched on her radar as the aircraft fought against wind shear that was tossing it around like a toy. The pilot was skilled, but even the best aviator couldn't compensate for the atmospheric chaos that surrounded the base. Mayday, Mayday, this is Dustoff 7, experiencing severe turbulence and electrical system failures. Requesting emergency landing clearance. Jessica was already on her feet, calculating wind patterns and electromagnetic interference zones. Tower Control, Vector Dustoff 7 to Landing Zone Bravo. Wind there is 15 knots gusting to 25. Manageable for emergency landing. The weather station, LZ Bravo, is on the opposite side of the base. That adds 10 minutes to casualty. Transport time. Tower Control, LZ Alpha has wind shear that will down that aircraft. LZ Bravo is the only viable option. There was a pause filled with radio static and the sound of her own heartbeat. Finally, Tower Control responded with obvious reluctance. Dustoff 7, diverted to LZ Bravo. The weather station is calling the shots. The helicopter managed a hard but successful landing at LZ Bravo. 2 critically wounded soldiers were evacuated to the base medical facility, alive because Jessica had read the atmospheric conditions correctly. But instead of appreciation, she received a visit from Major Richardson, the base operations officer, 30 minutes later. "Morgan, I need to talk to you about tonight's weather call." Jessica looked up from her post-storm analysis, where she was documenting the unusual electromagnetic readings she'd detected. "Yes, sir?" The flight crew wasn't happy about the diversion. Added complications to an already difficult mission. "Sir, the atmospheric conditions over LZ Alpha would have resulted in aircraft loss. The electromagnetic interference alone was sufficient to compromise navigation systems." Major Richardson was a career infantry officer who'd been promoted to operations based on his combat experience, not his understanding of atmospheric sciences. He looked at Jessica's meteorological equipment with the same expression most people, reserved for abstract art. "Lieutenant, I need weather reports, not theoretical analysis. When pilots ask for landing conditions, give them wind speed and visibility. Leave the science experiments to the research stations." Jessica felt the familiar frustration rising in her chest. "Sir, meteorological analysis is science. Understanding atmospheric conditions requires more than just reading basic instruments. What it requires, Lieutenant, is staying in your lane. You're here to provide weather support, not to second-guess flight operations." After Major Richardson left, Jessica returned to her analysis of the storm data. The electromagnetic anomalies bothered her. Desert thunderstorms didn't typically generate the kind of electromagnetic signature she'd recorded. The frequency patterns were wrong, the intensity was wrong, and the duration was definitely wrong. She pulled up historical weather data for the region, cross-referencing atmospheric conditions with known enemy activity patterns. Jessica had been studying the relationship between weather and military operations since her academy days. Weather wasn't just about rain and sunshine. It was about visibility, communication range, aircraft performance, and tactical advantages. What she found in the data made her reach for her secure telephone. "Colonel Martinez, this is Lieutenant Morgan at Phobe Sentinel. I need to discuss some unusual atmospheric readings from tonight's storm." Colonel Elena Martinez was the regional intelligence officer, one of the few senior officers who'd ever taken Jessica's meteorological assessments seriously. "Go ahead, Lieutenant." "Ma'am, I recorded electromagnetic interference patterns during tonight's storm that don't match natural atmospheric phenomena. The frequency signatures suggest artificial generation." There was a pause. "Artificial generation of what, Lieutenant?" "Electromagnetic interference that could mask aircraft approach signatures, disrupt our communication systems, and create atmospheric conditions favorable for low-altitude infiltration." Another pause, longer this time. "Are you suggesting that tonight's storm was artificially enhanced?" Jessica looked at her data screens, where the numbers told a story that her meteorological training recognized but her military experience found almost impossible to believe. "Ma'am, I'm suggesting that someone used natural storm conditions as cover for electromagnetic warfare designed to compromise our base defenses." "That's a significant accusation, Lieutenant. What's your confidence level?" Jessica had learned to be precise about her professional assessments. Lives depended on accurate weather forecasting, and credibility was something she'd fought to establish since arriving at Phobe Sentinel. "Ma'am, 85% confidence that tonight's electromagnetic anomalies were artificially generated. 60% confidence that they were coordinated with enemy activity. I'll review your data, Lieutenant. Send me everything you have." After transmitting her analysis to Colonel Martinez, Jessica continued her shift, monitoring the atmospheric conditions around Phobe Sentinel. The storm had passed, leaving behind clear skies and the kind of desert silence that made every sound seem amplified, but her instruments were still. detecting residual electromagnetic signatures, faint but persistent, like an echo of the nights. Atmospheric chaos. Jessica began expanding her analysis beyond immediate weather conditions. She pulled satellite imagery, reviewed atmospheric patterns for the past week, and cross-referenced her data with intelligence reports about enemy activity in the region. What emerged was a pattern that made her question everything she thought. She knew about her role at Phobos Sentinel. The electromagnetic anomalies weren't random. They corresponded to specific atmospheric conditions that would provide tactical advantages for certain types of military operations. Low-altitude flight approaches, communication disruption, radar interference. Someone was using the weather as a weapon. Jessica had always understood that meteorology was more than just forecasting rain and sunshine. Weather affected every aspect of military operations, from aircraft performance to soldier endurance to communication range. But she'd never considered that atmospheric conditions could be deliberately manipulated for tactical advantage. Her training at the Air Force Academy had included courses on environmental warfare, but those had seemed theoretical, academic exercises rather than practical combat applications. Now staring at data that suggested someone was artificially enhancing natural weather phenomena for military purposes, Jessica realized that her expertise in atmospheric physics might be far more valuable than anyone at Phobos Sentinel understood. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The question was whether anyone would listen to her analysis before it was too late. As the sun rose over the Afghan mountains, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and orange, Jessica compiled her findings into a comprehensive report. Electromagnetic interference patterns, atmospheric anomalies, weather modification indicators, and tactical implications. For the first time since arriving at Phobos Sentinel, she felt like she was using her education and training for something more significant than routine weather forecasting. The officers who called her just the weather girl had no idea that atmospheric science could provide intelligence capabilities that traditional reconnaissance methods might miss. Jessica submitted her report through official channels, but she also began her own investigation. If someone was using weather modification technology for military purposes, they would need sophisticated equipment, precise timing, and detailed knowledge of atmospheric conditions. More importantly, they would need to be close enough to the target area to coordinate their artificial enhancements with natural weather phenomena. Jessica began reviewing meteorological data from surrounding regions, looking for similar electromagnetic signatures and atmospheric anomalies. If this was part of a larger operation, there would be patterns. Weather modification technology couldn't operate in isolation. It required coordination, planning, and resources. What she found in the regional atmospheric data convinced her that last night's storm had been just the beginning. Someone was preparing for something much larger, and they were using the weather as both a weapon and a shield. The briefing room at Phobos Sentinel felt suffocating despite the air conditioning working overtime against the Afghan heat. Jessica sat at the far end of the conference table, her laptop open to atmospheric data charts that painted a picture none of the assembled officers wanted to acknowledge. Colonel Martinez had called the meeting after reviewing Jessica's electromagnetic analysis from the previous night's storm. Present were Major Richardson, Captain Blake Harrison from Intelligence, Lieutenant Colonel David Stone from Base Security, and Staff Sergeant Amy Chen from Communications. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Martinez began, "Lieutenant Morgan has identified atmospheric anomalies that warrant immediate attention. Lieutenant, please present your findings." Jessica stood, connecting her laptop to the room's display system. The first slide showed electromagnetic frequency patterns recorded during the storm. At 0230 hours, our meteorological sensors detected electromagnetic interference patterns inconsistent with natural atmospheric phenomena. Major Richardson shifted impatiently in his chair. Lieutenant, thunderstorms generate electromagnetic interference. That's basic meteorology. Yes, sir, but not at these specific frequencies. Jessica clicked to the next slide, showing comparative data. Natural lightning produces broadband electromagnetic pulses across multiple frequencies. What we recorded shows concentrated energy at frequencies specifically designed to interfere with military communication systems and radar arrays. Captain. Harrison leaned forward, studying the data with professional interest. Unlike the other officers, Harrison had a background in electronic warfare and understood the implications of Jessica's analysis. Lieutenant, these frequency patterns, Harrison said, pointing to specific data points. They match known electronic warfare signatures from advanced atmospheric manipulation technology. Atmospheric manipulation? Lieutenant Colonel Stone's voice carried skepticism. You're talking about weather control. That's science fiction. Jessica had anticipated this reaction. She clicked to her next slide, showing declassified documents about weather modification research. Sir, atmospheric manipulation technology has existed since the 1960s. Cloud seeding, ionospheric heating, electromagnetic pulse generation. The technology has advanced significantly since then. Even if such technology exists, Major Richardson interrupted, why would anyone use it here? FOB Sentinel isn't exactly a strategic target. Jessica felt her pulse quicken. This was the part of her analysis that had kept her awake since dawn, reviewing satellite imagery and regional intelligence reports. Sir, FOB Sentinel may not seem strategically significant, but our location provides unique advantages for atmospheric manipulation operations. She clicked on a topographical map, showing the base's position relative to surrounding mountain ranges. Our elevation and geographic position create natural atmospheric focusing effects. Weather modification technology deployed in these mountains could affect atmospheric conditions across a much wider area. Staff Sergeant Chun spoke up from her position near the communications equipment. Lieutenant, yesterday during the storm, we experienced communication failures that lasted longer than typical electromagnetic interference. Radio systems went down for nearly 2 hours. That's consistent with targeted electronic warfare, Jessica replied. Natural electromagnetic interference from storms typically lasts minutes, not hours. Extended communication disruption suggests deliberate signal jamming coordinated with atmospheric manipulation. Colonel Martinez was taking detailed notes. Lieutenant, what's your assessment of the tactical implications? Jessica had spent hours analyzing this question, cross-referencing meteorological data with military intelligence, reports about enemy capabilities and regional activity patterns. Ma'am, coordinated weather modification and electronic warfare could provide several tactical advantages to hostile forces. She clicked to her next slide, showing potential attack scenarios. First, atmospheric manipulation can create communication blackouts that prevent coordination between our units and outside support. Second, weather modification can ground our aircraft while providing cover for enemy movement. Third, electromagnetic interference can disrupt our radar and surveillance systems. Captain Harrison was studying the data intently. Lieutenant, do you have any intelligence about specific threats or enemy capabilities in this region? Jessica hesitated. Her meteorological training hadn't included intelligence analysis, but her review of regional atmospheric data had revealed patterns that suggested coordinated operations. Sir, I've identified similar electromagnetic signatures at 3 other locations within a 50-mile radius over the past 2 weeks. The room fell silent. Lieutenant Colonel Stone was the first to speak. Are you suggesting a coordinated campaign of weather modification attacks? I'm suggesting that someone with advanced atmospheric manipulation technology has been conducting operations in this region, and last night's storm was either a test or preparation for something larger. Major Richardson stood abruptly. This is speculation based on meteorological data. We don't have actionable intelligence about specific threats or enemy positions. Jessica felt frustration rising but kept her voice professional. Sir, meteorological intelligence is actionable intelligence. Weather affects every aspect of military operations. If someone is manipulating atmospheric conditions for tactical advantage, that's a direct threat to base security. Colonel Martinez intervened before the discussion could escalate. Lieutenant Morgan, what additional analysis do you need to confirm your assessment? Jessica had been hoping for this question. Ma'am, I need access to regional satellite imagery, electromagnetic spectrum monitoring data from surrounding bases, and historical weather patterns for comparison. I also need authorization to expand my atmospheric monitoring beyond routine weather forecasting. Expanded monitoring how? Lieutenant Colonel Stone asked. Sir, our current meteorological equipment is designed for weather forecasting, not intelligence gathering. With additional sensors and analysis capabilities, I could track electromagnetic signatures, monitor atmospheric anomalies, and potentially predict when and where weather modification operations might occur. Captain Harrison was nodding thoughtfully. That makes sense from an electronic warfare perspective. If we can detect their atmospheric manipulation technology, we can predict their operational capabilities. Major Richardson remained skeptical. We're talking about dedicating significant resources to investigate what might be natural weather phenomena. I need more than electromagnetic readings to justify operational changes. Jessica clicked to her final slide, showing a detailed analysis of the previous night's storm track and timing. Sir, this storm appeared on satellite imagery at 2,100 hours, intensified at an unprecedented rate, maintained coherence despite terrain that should have disrupted it, and dissipated exactly 30 minutes after passing over our base. She paused, letting the implications sink in. Natural storms don't follow such precise timing. Someone was controlling that weather system. The room was quiet except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of aircraft engines from the flight line. Finally, Colonel Martinez spoke. Lieutenant Morgan, I'm authorizing expanded atmospheric monitoring. Captain Harrison, I want you to coordinate with Lieutenant Morgan on electronic warfare aspects of this investigation. Staff Sergeant Chun, monitor all communication anomalies and report them immediately. Major Richardson looked frustrated, but didn't argue with a direct order from the colonel. Lieutenant Colonel Stone was already making notes about security implications. One more thing, Colonel Martinez continued. This investigation is classified. We don't discuss weather modification or electronic warfare capabilities outside this room until we have confirmation of the threat. As the meeting concluded, Jessica felt a mixture of validation and apprehension. For the first time since arriving at Phobe Sentinel, her expertise was being taken seriously. But the implications of her analysis were far more dangerous than routine weather forecasting. After the other officers left, Captain Harrison approached Jessica's position at the conference table. Lieutenant, I've been working on electronic warfare for 8 years. What you've identified matches advanced atmospheric manipulation technology that we've only seen in laboratory settings. Are you familiar with this technology? Familiar enough to know that if someone has deployed it operationally, they're either extremely well-funded or they have state-level resources behind them. Harrison's expression was grim. Either way, this isn't a random attack. It's preparation for something bigger. Jessica felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Preparation for what? That's what we need to figure out before they're ready to implement whatever they're planning. That afternoon, Jessica began setting up expanded atmospheric monitoring using equipment requisitioned through Colonel Martinez's authorization. Additional electromagnetic sensors, atmospheric pressure monitors, and spectrum analysis capabilities that would allow her to detect weather modification technology from much greater distances. As she calibrated the new equipment, Staff Sergeant. Chun arrived with communication logs from the previous night. Lieutenant, you asked about communication anomalies during the storm. Take a look at this. The logs showed communication failures that followed a specific pattern. First, long range. RADIO communications went down, then satellite communications. Finally, even short-range tactical radios experienced interference. The sequence suggested deliberate jamming designed to isolate the base from outside support. Sergeant, this jamming pattern, Jessica said, studying the timestamps. It corresponds exactly with the electromagnetic frequencies I recorded. Someone was coordinating communication disruption with atmospheric manipulation. That's what worries me, Chun replied. If they can cut our communications while controlling local weather, they can effectively isolate us from reinforcements while creating conditions favorable for their own operations. Jessica was beginning to understand the scope of the threat they were facing. Weather modification technology combined with electronic warfare capabilities could turn atmospheric conditions into a tactical weapon. Enemy forces could create communication blackouts, ground-friendly aircraft, disrupt surveillance systems, and provide cover for their own movements. Sergeant, I need historical communication logs for the past month. If they've been testing this technology, there should be patterns we can identify. Chun provided the requested logs, and Jessica spent the rest of the afternoon correlating communication anomalies with atmospheric data. What she found confirmed her worst suspicions. Over the past 3 weeks, there had been 12 instances of unexplained communication interference, each corresponding with unusual electromagnetic signatures in her meteorological data. The pattern was escalating. With more frequent and more sophisticated attacks, someone was learning the base's communication vulnerabilities while testing weather modification technology. They were gathering intelligence and refining their capabilities. Jessica was staring at evidence of a coordinated intelligence operation that had been ongoing for weeks, and no one had recognized it because the attacks were disguised as natural weather phenomena. As evening approached, she compiled her expanded analysis into a comprehensive threat assessment. The data painted a picture of sophisticated enemy capabilities and methodical preparation for what could only be a major attack. The question was no longer whether Phobe's Sentinel was facing a weather modification threat. The question was how much time they had before that threat became a full-scale assault. The alarm pierced the pre-dawn silence at 0445 hours, jolting Jessica from a restless sleep filled with electromagnetic frequency patterns and atmospheric pressure charts. She was dressed and running toward the meteorological station before her mind fully processed what the klaxon meant. Incoming aircraft, unidentified, approaching from the northwest. Her new monitoring equipment was already screaming warnings when she burst through the station door. Electromagnetic interference levels were spiking across multiple frequencies. Atmospheric pressure was fluctuating in patterns that defied natural weather phenomena, and her spectrum analyzers were detecting the unmistakable signatures of active weather modification technology. Met Station, this is Tower Control. We need immediate atmospheric assessment. Unknown aircraft approaching at low altitude, radar signature intermittent. Jessica's fingers flew across her instruments, correlating atmospheric data with the radar interference patterns. What she saw made her blood run cold. The electromagnetic signatures weren't random. They were creating a moving zone of radar disruption that was traveling with the unidentified aircraft. Tower Control, you're not dealing with equipment malfunction. The aircraft is using coordinated electromagnetic warfare to mask its approach. Recommend immediate alert status and scramble interceptors. Met Station, we don't have confirmation of hostile intent. Could be a friendly aircraft with communication problems. Jessica stared at her screens, where the data told a story that her 3 weeks of investigation had taught her to read like a tactical manual. The electromagnetic warfare signatures matched the patterns she'd been tracking. The atmospheric manipulation technology was creating a moving storm cell that provided perfect cover for low-altitude penetration. Tower control. This aircraft is using weather modification technology identical to the systems that have been conducting operations against this base for 3 weeks. This is not friendly with communication problems. This is a test run. The radio fell silent for nearly 30 seconds. When tower control responded, the voice belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Stone instead of the usual air traffic controller. Lieutenant Morgan, this is base security. Confirm your assessment. Are you stating with certainty that the approaching aircraft represents a hostile threat? Jessica looked at her atmospheric data, her electromagnetic readings, and the weather. Modification signatures that painted an unmistakable picture of coordinated electronic warfare. For 3 weeks, she'd been tracking patterns and building evidence. Now, with hostile aircraft using the same technology to penetrate their airspace, she faced the moment that would define her career and possibly save or doom everyone on the base. Base security. I have positive identification of weather modification technology being used to mask aircraft approach. Electromagnetic warfare signatures match known hostile capabilities. Confidence level, 95% hostile intent. Copy, Met Station. Scrambling interceptors and implementing base defense protocols. Jessica continued monitoring as F-16 fighters launched from the base runway, their engines screaming in. The desert morning. Her atmospheric sensors tracked the interceptors as they climbed toward the intruding aircraft. But something was wrong with the atmospheric readings in their flight path. The weather modification technology wasn't just creating radar interference. It was generating actual atmospheric disturbances that would affect aircraft performance. Wind shear, electromagnetic interference with navigation systems, and rapid pressure changes that could destabilize even military aircraft. Base security. The atmospheric manipulation is creating flight hazards for our interceptors. Recommend vectors to avoid the electromagnetic interference zone. Met Station. Our pilots are trained for adverse weather conditions. Sir, this isn't adverse weather. This is artificially generated atmospheric warfare designed specifically to down aircraft. Jessica watched her instruments as the F-16s entered the interference zone. Immediately, their radar signatures became erratic, and radio communications degraded to static-filled fragments. The weather modification technology was affecting their aircraft exactly as she'd predicted. Falcon 1 to base, experiencing severe electromagnetic interference and navigation system malfunctions. Requesting vector for emergency return. Falcon 2 to base, confirming navigation problems and radio difficulties. Unable to maintain an intercept course. Jessica was already calculating atmospheric conditions outside the interference zone. Base security, vector interceptors to bearing 045, altitude 25,000 feet. Clear atmospheric conditions for navigation and communication recovery. The F-16s followed her recommended vectors and successfully recovered outside the electromagnetic interference zone. But the unidentified aircraft had used the confusion to disappear, vanishing from radar as completely as if it had never existed. All stations, this is Colonel Martinez. The unidentified aircraft has left our airspace. Stand down from alert status, but maintain elevated security posture. 30 minutes later, Jessica found herself once again in the base briefing room. But the atmosphere was completely different from her previous presentations. No longer was she the meteorological technician providing routine weather updates. She was the intelligence analyst who'd identified and tracked a sophisticated enemy capability that had just penetrated their airspace. Lieutenant Morgan, Colonel Martinez began. Your early warning and atmospheric analysis prevented what could have been a successful enemy reconnaissance operation. The interceptors might have been lost without your guidance. Major Richardson, who'd dismissed her weather modification theories just days earlier, was studying her atmospheric data with new respect. "Lieutenant, you're saying this aircraft used weather control technology to conduct intelligence gathering?" "Yes, sir. The electromagnetic signatures and atmospheric manipulation patterns are identical to what I've been tracking for 3 weeks. This was a reconnaissance flight using weather modification to mask their approach, gather intelligence on our defensive responses, and test our ability to counter their atmospheric warfare capabilities." Captain Harrison was reviewing communication intercepts from the incident. The timing was sophisticated. They waited until our standard patrol aircraft were returning to base, approached during the shift change for our radar operators, and used atmospheric conditions that maximize the effectiveness of their electromagnetic warfare. Lieutenant Colonel Stone leaned forward. "Lieutenant Morgan, if this was reconnaissance for a larger operation, what would you expect next?" Jessica had been analyzing this question since watching the unidentified aircraft disappear from their sensors. "Sir, they've now confirmed our atmospheric monitoring capabilities, tested our defensive responses, and identified vulnerabilities in our air defense systems. Based on the sophistication of their weather modification technology, I'd expect a coordinated attack within 72 hours. The room fell silent. Finally, Colonel Martinez spoke. "Lieutenant, that's a specific timeline. What's your confidence level?" Jessica thought about the 3 weeks of data she'd compiled, the patterns she'd identified, and the escalating sophistication of the electromagnetic warfare attacks. "Ma'am, atmospheric manipulation technology requires precise timing to coordinate with natural weather patterns. Based on meteorological forecasts and the patterns I've been tracking, there's a 48-hour window beginning tomorrow night when atmospheric conditions will be optimal for large-scale weather modification operations." "Large-scale operations?" "Major," Richardson asked. "Sir, everything we've seen has been preparation for something bigger. Single aircraft reconnaissance, communication system testing, atmospheric manipulation capability assessment. They've been gathering intelligence and refining their technology. A coordinated attack would use weather modification to create multiple simultaneous threats." Jessica clicked through her prepared analysis, showing weather forecasts and electromagnetic warfare projections. They could generate communication blackouts across the entire region, create atmospheric conditions that ground all aircraft operations, and use weather as cover for ground assault operations. Captain Harrison was making rapid calculations. If they can coordinate weather modification with ground operations, they could effectively neutralize our air support while preventing communication with reinforcements. "Exactly," Jessica confirmed. "Weather becomes both a weapon and a shield. We'd be fighting blind while they operate with complete atmospheric intelligence and control." Lieutenant Colonel Stone was reviewing base defense protocols. Colonel Martinez, "If Lieutenant Morgan's assessment is accurate, we need to alert regional command and request immediate reinforcements." "Agreed, but first I need confirmation of the threat level." Colonel Martinez turned to Jessica. "Lieutenant, I'm authorizing you to conduct intensive atmospheric monitoring for the next 48 hours. If you detect preparations for large-scale weather modification operations, we implement emergency defense protocols immediately." Jessica felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. For 3 weeks, she'd been tracking patterns and building theories. Now she was being asked to predict enemy operations and provide early warning for a potential attack on the entire base. "Ma'am, I'll need expanded monitoring capabilities and direct communication links to base security. If they begin large-scale atmospheric manipulation, we'll have minimal warning time before the attack begins." "Granted." Captain Harrison coordinates electronic warfare countermeasures with Lieutenant Morgan's atmospheric monitoring. Staff Sergeant Chun, establish redundant communication systems that can operate during electromagnetic interference. As the briefing concluded, Jessica realized that her role at FOB Sentinel had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just the weather girl providing routine forecasts. She was now the base's primary defense against an enemy capability that traditional military training hadn't prepared anyone to counter. But with that recognition came a terrifying responsibility. If her analysis was wrong, valuable resources would be wasted on preparations for an attack that might never come. If her analysis was right, she might be the only person who could provide early warning before atmospheric warfare turned FOB Sentinel into a death trap. That afternoon, Jessica worked feverishly to calibrate her expanded monitoring systems and establish communication protocols with base security. Her meteorological station was transformed into a combination weather center and electronic warfare monitoring post, equipped with sensors that could detect atmospheric manipulation from hundreds of miles away. As evening approached, she began detecting the first signs that her 48-hour prediction might be optimistic. Electromagnetic anomalies were appearing on her sensors from multiple directions, suggesting that weather modification equipment was being positioned around the base in a coordinated pattern. Someone was preparing for an attack, and they were using the atmosphere itself as their primary weapon. Jessica keyed her radio to base security. "Lieutenant Colonel Stone, this is Met Station. I'm detecting preliminary electromagnetic signatures consistent with weather modification. Positioning. Recommend implementation of defensive protocols immediately." Met Station confirmed. "All units, this is base security, implementing defense condition 2. This is not a drill." As alarm klaxons echoed across FOB Sentinel, Jessica continued monitoring atmospheric conditions with the grim knowledge that she'd become the early warning system for a type of warfare that most military personnel didn't even know existed. Weather Girl was about to become the base's last line of defense against an enemy that could control the sky itself. The secure video conference connection flickered to life at 1200 hours, revealing the face of General Patricia Walsh from Regional Command. Jessica had never spoken directly to a general officer, but Colonel Martinez had insisted she present her findings to the highest levels of military leadership. "Lieutenant Morgan," General Walsh began without preamble, "I've reviewed your atmospheric analysis reports. I need you to explain to me how weather forecasting became a matter of national security." Jessica had spent the morning preparing for this moment, organizing 3 weeks of data into a comprehensive intelligence briefing that would convince senior leadership of the threat they were facing. "Ma'am, weather modification technology has evolved beyond simple cloud seeding or precipitation enhancement. What we're detecting is militarized atmospheric manipulation designed for tactical warfare." She activated her prepared presentation, showing satellite imagery and electromagnetic spectrum analysis. "General, the enemy has deployed at least 6 weather modification installations within a 200-mile radius of FOB Sentinel. Each installation is capable of generating localized atmospheric disturbances, electromagnetic interference, and coordinated weather patterns." General Walsh leaned forward, studying the satellite data. "Lieutenant, these installations, you're certain they're enemy facilities?" "Ma'am, the electromagnetic signatures are consistent with advanced ionospheric heating technology, similar to the HARP research facility in Alaska, but configured for tactical applications. The frequency patterns match known weather modification capabilities, and the timing of their operations corresponds with intelligence regarding enemy troop movements in the region." Captain Harrison, participating via video link from the Electronic Warfare Center, added supporting evidence. "General, we've confirmed Lieutenant Morgan's atmospheric analysis through independent electronic warfare monitoring. The enemy is using coordinated electromagnetic pulse generation to create artificial weather systems that provide tactical advantages such as..." Jessica clicked to her next slide, showing detailed analysis of enemy capabilities. "Ma'am," Coordinated weather modification provides multiple military advantages. First, artificial storm generation can ground all aircraft operations while providing cover for enemy movement. Second, electromagnetic interference can create communication blackouts that prevent coordination with support forces. Third, atmospheric manipulation can disrupt satellite surveillance and radar systems. And you believe they're preparing to use these capabilities against Phobe Sentinel? General, based on the positioning of their installations and the escalating pattern of atmospheric testing, I assess that they're preparing for a coordinated attack designed to isolate and neutralize our forward operating capability. Jessica's voice carried the conviction of someone who'd spent weeks analyzing every detail of the threat. The reconnaissance aircraft that penetrated our airspace yesterday was conducting final intelligence, gathering before a major operation. General Walsh was silent for nearly a minute, reviewing the data and considering the implications. Lieutenant Morgan, if your assessment is correct, this represents a fundamental shift in warfare capabilities. Weather as a strategic weapon. Yes, ma'am. Traditional military doctrine doesn't account for enemies who can control atmospheric conditions. Our defensive strategies, communication protocols, and air support capabilities are all vulnerable to coordinated weather modification attacks. What's your recommended response? Jessica had been preparing for this question since realizing the scope of the threat. Ma'am, we need to identify and neutralize the weather modification installations before they can coordinate a large-scale attack. Additionally, we need to develop countermeasures for atmospheric warfare and establish communication protocols that can function during electromagnetic interference. Colonel Martinez, who had been listening to the briefing from her position at Phobe Sentinel, added operational context. General, Lieutenant Morgan has identified the enemy installations through atmospheric analysis, but neutralizing them would require special operations capability beyond our current resources. Understood. I'm authorizing immediate deployment of a special operations team with electronic warfare specialists. Lieutenant Morgan, I need you to provide precise targeting information for these installations. Jessica felt a surge of responsibility mixed with apprehension. Her atmospheric analysis was about to guide military operations against targets she'd identified through weather data. Ma'am, I can provide coordinates and operational characteristics for each installation, but I need additional monitoring equipment to track their real-time capabilities. What kind of equipment? Captain Harrison responded. General, atmospheric warfare requires specialized detection systems. We need ionospheric monitoring equipment, electromagnetic spectrum analyzers, and satellite communication links that can operate during interference. Approved. I'm also authorizing coordination with the National Weather Service and NOAA for additional atmospheric intelligence support. General Walsh's expression was grim. Ladies and gentlemen, if Lieutenant Morgan's analysis is accurate, we're facing a new category of warfare that could fundamentally change military operations worldwide. After the video conference ended, Jessica found herself at the center of a rapidly expanding intelligence operation. Within hours, transport aircraft began arriving at Phobe Sentinel, carrying equipment and personnel she'd never seen before. Dr. Michael Thompson from the National Weather Service arrived with atmospheric monitoring equipment that made Jessica's existing sensors look primitive. Dr. Sarah Kim from NOAA brought satellite communication systems designed specifically for electromagnetic warfare environments. Major Robert Davis from the Special Operations Command arrived with a team of electronic warfare specialists who spoke in technical acronyms Jessica was still learning. Lieutenant Morgan, Dr. Thompson said, as they calibrated the new monitoring equipment, your identification of militarized weather modification is unprecedented. We've theorized about atmospheric warfare capabilities, but you've documented actual operational deployment. The new equipment revealed the full scope of what they were facing. The 6 weather modification installations were part of a coordinated network capable of generating atmospheric disturbances across thousands of square miles. Each installation could operate independently or in coordination with others to create weather patterns that would provide tactical advantages for ground operations. "Dr. Thompson, look at this," Jessica said, pointing to data from the enhanced atmospheric sensors. "They're not just creating random weather disturbances. They're generating specific atmospheric conditions that will maximize the effectiveness of conventional military operations." The data showed wind patterns that would carry chemical or biological agents, atmospheric pressure systems that would interfere with precision-guided munitions, and electromagnetic interference zones that would blind satellite surveillance. Someone had weaponized the atmosphere with scientific precision. Dr. Kim was monitoring satellite communications from her mobile command center. "Lieutenant, we're detecting increased activity from all 6 installations. Electromagnetic output is climbing steadily." Jessica reviewed the atmospheric data with a growing alarm. "They're beginning coordination protocols. Based on the energy output patterns, they'll reach operational capability within 18 hours. Major Davis approached with intelligence updates from his Special Operations team. "Lieutenant Morgan, my electronic warfare specialists have confirmed your installation locations through independent analysis. We're preparing to neutralize these targets, but we need real-time atmospheric intelligence during the operation." "Major, neutralizing the installations won't be enough if they begin their atmospheric manipulation before your team reaches the targets. Once they achieve coordination, they can maintain weather modification even if some installations are destroyed." "What do you recommend?" Jessica studied the installation positions and energy output patterns. "We need to disrupt their coordination capability before they reach full operational status. If we can create electromagnetic interference that prevents installation-to-installation communication, we can force them to operate independently instead of as a coordinated network." Captain Harrison, who had been monitoring enemy communications, added crucial intelligence. "Lieutenant, we've intercepted communications indicating that their atmospheric manipulation operation is scheduled to begin at 2,300 hours tonight. That gives us 11 hours to prevent coordination. Can your Special Operations team reach the installations in time?" Major Davis reviewed tactical maps and deployment timelines. "We can reach 3 installations before 2,300 hours, but the other 3 are too distant for simultaneous neutralization." Jessica felt the pieces of a tactical solution forming in her mind. "Major, what if we don't need to reach all the installations? What if we can use their own weather modification technology against them?" "Explain." "The installations require precise atmospheric conditions to operate effectively. If we can generate electromagnetic interference at specific frequencies, we can disrupt their ionospheric heating capability and prevent coordinated weather modification." Dr. Thompson was nodding thoughtfully. "That's theoretically possible, but it would require electromagnetic pulse generation at precisely the right frequencies and timing, which we can calculate using atmospheric modeling," Jessica replied. "If we position electromagnetic warfare equipment at specific locations and coordinate the timing with natural atmospheric conditions, we can create interference patterns that will disrupt their weather modification capability." Major Davis was already making operational calculations. "How many positions would we need, and what's the timeline for deployment?" Jessica turned to her atmospheric computers, running models that would calculate optimal positioning for electromagnetic countermeasures. "Give me 2 hours to run the calculations, and I can provide deployment coordinates and timing requirements." As afternoon turned to evening, Jessica worked with unprecedented intensity, coordinating atmospheric modeling with electronic warfare planning and special operations deployment. Her meteorological station had become the nerve center for a military Operation unlike anything in modern warfare. The enhanced monitoring equipment showed that enemy installations were steadily increasing their electromagnetic output, building toward the coordination threshold that would allow large-scale atmospheric manipulation. Time was running short, and the success or failure of their countermeasures would depend on her ability to predict and disrupt weather modification technology with mathematical precision. Lieutenant Morgan, Colonel Martinez said, reviewing her operational calculations. You're asking us to coordinate special operations deployment, electronic warfare positioning, and electromagnetic pulse generation with timing accurate to within minutes. That's an extraordinarily complex operation. Ma'am, atmospheric warfare requires extraordinary countermeasures. If we allow them to achieve coordinated weather modification, they can create conditions that will make conventional military response impossible. Jessica submitted her final calculations at 1900 hours, providing deployment coordinates for electronic warfare equipment and timing requirements for electromagnetic pulse generation. The plan required perfect coordination between multiple units, precise atmospheric modeling, and electromagnetic countermeasures that had never been tested in operational conditions. Major Davis reviewed the operational plan with his special operations team. Lieutenant, this plan assumes we can generate electromagnetic interference powerful enough to disrupt ionospheric heating from distances of over 50 miles. That's at the edge of our technical capabilities. Major, it's also at the edge of their technical capabilities. Weather modification technology is extremely sensitive to electromagnetic interference. We don't need to overpower their systems, we need to disrupt their coordination. As teams deployed to their assigned positions and Jessica prepared for the most critical atmospheric monitoring of her career, she realized that the next 4 hours would determine whether weather could be successfully weaponized on a strategic scale. The enemy was preparing to turn the atmosphere itself into a weapon of war. Jessica's calculations and countermeasures were the only thing standing between them and a new era of atmospheric warfare. The Operation Command Center materialized in the underground bunker of FOB Sentinel like something from a science fiction movie. Banks of monitors displayed atmospheric data, satellite imagery, electromagnetic spectrum analysis, and tactical positions across a 300-mile radius. Jessica stood at the center of it all, coordinating the most complex meteorological operation in military history. Lightning Team is in position at Grid Alpha 7, came the voice of Captain Jennifer Martinez, Special Operations Team Leader, through the secure communication system. Electronic warfare package deployed and ready for activation on your signal. Jessica acknowledged while monitoring atmospheric pressure readings that would determine the precise timing of their electromagnetic countermeasures. Copy, Lightning Team. Stand by for atmospheric window calculation. Across the region, 5 additional teams were positioning themselves according to Jessica's mathematical models. Each team carried portable electronic warfare equipment designed to generate electromagnetic pulses at frequencies that would disrupt ionospheric heating technology. The coordination required split-second timing based on atmospheric conditions that Jessica was calculating in real-time. Dr. Thompson worked alongside her. MONITO, ionospheric activity using equipment that had never been deployed in a tactical environment. Jessica, the enemy installations are showing coordinated power cycling. They're testing their synchronization protocols. How long until they reach operational coordination? Based on their current power increase rate, approximately 90 minutes. Jessica turned to Major Davis, who was coordinating special operations deployment from his mobile command center. Major, your teams need to be in final position within 60 minutes. Once the enemy installations achieve coordination, our electromagnetic countermeasures become significantly more difficult. Roger that. All teams, this is command. Final positioning required within 60 minutes. Time is critical. The complexity of the operation was staggering. Jessica had calculated that disrupting the enemy's weather modification network required electromagnetic interference generated from 6 specific locations at precise times coordinated with natural atmospheric conditions. Each position had to activate their electronic warfare equipment within a 30-second window, or the interference patterns would fail to achieve the necessary disruption. Dr. Kim approached with satellite communication updates. Jessica, we've established direct links with NOAA's atmospheric monitoring satellites. You'll have real-time ionospheric data for timing calculations. The satellite data revealed the full sophistication of what they were countering. The enemy weather modification installations weren't just heating the ionosphere randomly, they were creating precise electromagnetic patterns designed to generate specific atmospheric effects. Storm systems, pressure differentials, wind patterns, and electromagnetic interference zones could all be created and controlled with scientific precision. Dr. Kim, look at this ionospheric heating pattern, Jessica said, pointing to data from the satellite feeds. They're not just creating weather, they're creating atmospheric conditions that will enhance the effectiveness of conventional weapons. The pattern showed electromagnetic heating designed to create atmospheric density variations that would affect missile trajectories, pressure systems that would carry chemical agents efficiently, and wind patterns that would interfere with aircraft operations while providing favorable conditions for enemy helicopters and drones. Staff Sergeant Chun arrived with communication intercepts that added urgency to their preparations. Lieutenant, we've decoded enemy communications indicating that their atmospheric manipulation is coordinated with ground operations. They have mechanized infantry positioned to exploit the weather conditions they're planning to create. Jessica felt pieces of the enemy strategy clicking into place. The weather modification wasn't just about creating storms or interference. It was about establishing atmospheric conditions that would provide tactical advantages for a coordinated ground assault while neutralizing the base's defensive capabilities. Sergeant, what's the size of the ground force? Intelligence estimates indicate battalion-strength mechanized infantry with air support elements positioned in the mountains northeast of our location. Major Davis was reviewing tactical implications with his operations team. Lieutenant Morgan, if they can coordinate weather modification with ground assault, they're looking at a complete isolation and destruction scenario. Our air support gets grounded, communications get jammed, and they attack under cover of artificial weather systems. Major, that's why our electromagnetic countermeasures have to work perfectly. If we can prevent their weather modification coordination, we force them to operate without atmospheric advantages. Dr. Thompson was monitoring enemy installation activity with growing concern. Jessica, the electromagnetic output from all 6 installations is increasing exponentially. They're entering their final coordination phase ahead of schedule. Jessica reviewed her calculations rapidly. The atmospheric window she'd identified for optimal electromagnetic countermeasures was still 45 minutes away, but the enemy installations were reaching coordination capability earlier than her models had predicted. Dr. Thompson, can you calculate a new atmospheric window based on current ionospheric conditions? Working on it now. Dr. Thompson's fingers flew across his atmospheric modeling computers. New optimal window is in 28 minutes, but the effectiveness will be reduced by approximately 15%. Jessica weighed the tactical options rapidly. Wait for optimal atmospheric conditions and risk the enemy achieving full coordination, or execute countermeasures under suboptimal conditions that might not completely disrupt their weather modification capability. Major Davis, can your teams accelerate deployment? Negative. 3 teams are still 20 minutes from final position. Moving faster would compromise operational security. Jessica made a decision that would determine the success or failure of the entire operation. All teams, this is Met Command. We're implementing an accelerated coordination protocol. Electronic warfare activation in 25 minutes, regardless of team positioning. Jessica, Dr. Kim said quietly, if the electromagnetic countermeasures fail to completely disrupt their coordination, they'll still have partial weather modification capability, which means we need backup plans for partial atmospheric warfare scenarios. Jessica began calculating contingency options while monitoring the enemy installation activity. If their electromagnetic countermeasures achieved only partial disruption, the enemy would still be able to generate localized weather effects that could provide tactical advantages for their ground assault. Captain Harrison arrived with additional electronic warfare specialists who'd been flown in from regional command. Lieutenant, we've brought portable jamming equipment that can supplement your electromagnetic countermeasures. Where do you need? U.S. positioned? Jessica reviewed her atmospheric models and identified 3 additional positions where electronic warfare equipment could provide supplementary interference. Captain, position your teams here, here, and here, she said, marking locations on the tactical display. Coordinate your jamming frequencies with our main electromagnetic pulse generation. Understood. Teams deploying now. As teams moved into final positions, Jessica found herself coordinating a military operation that involved Special Operations Forces, electronic warfare specialists, atmospheric scientists, and satellite communication systems. Her meteorological expertise had become the foundation for countering a revolutionary warfare capability. Lightning Team to Met Command, in final position and ready for electronic warfare activation. Thunder Team to Met Command, positioned and standing by. Storm Team to Met Command, equipment deployed and awaiting activation signal. One by one, the teams reported readiness while Jessica monitored atmospheric conditions and enemy installation activity. The ionospheric heating patterns showed that the enemy installations were reaching critical coordination thresholds. In less than 20 minutes, they would be capable of generating coordinated weather systems across the entire region. Dr. Thompson, final atmospheric calculations for electromagnetic pulse timing. Optimal activation sequence calculated. Teams need to activate in 15-second intervals, beginning with the Lightning Team, then Thunder, Storm, Hurricane, Tornado, and Cyclone teams in sequence. Jessica reviewed the activation timeline while monitoring enemy electromagnetic output. The precision required was extraordinary. Each team had to activate their electronic warfare equipment at exactly the right moment to create interference patterns that would disrupt ionospheric heating. Across 6 separate installations. All teams, this is Met Command. Electronic warfare activation begins in 10 minutes. The activation sequence will be called in real time based on atmospheric conditions. Major Davis coordinated with his special operations teams while monitoring enemy ground force positioning. Lieutenant Morgan, intelligence indicates enemy mechanized units are beginning movement toward assault positions. If our countermeasures fail, they'll attack under optimal atmospheric conditions. Jessica felt the weight of responsibility that came with being the primary coordinator for an operation that could determine the outcome of a revolutionary form of warfare. Her atmospheric calculations and electromagnetic countermeasures were the only thing preventing enemy forces from achieving weather control that could change military operations forever. Dr. Kim, satellite communication links are established for real-time coordination? Confirmed. You have direct links to all teams and real-time atmospheric data from NOAA satellites. Jessica took a deep breath and prepared to coordinate the most complex atmospheric operation in military history. 6 special operations teams, electronic warfare specialists, and portable jamming equipment positioned across hundreds of miles. All coordinated with mathematical precision based on ionospheric conditions and electromagnetic interference patterns. All teams, this is Met Command. Atmospheric window approaching. Stand by for the activation sequence. The enemy weather modification. Installations were reaching peak electromagnetic output, building toward coordination that would allow them to control atmospheric conditions across the entire region. Jessica's countermeasures represented the only chance to prevent weaponized weather from becoming a reality. Lightning Team, stand by for activation in 60 seconds. Jessica watched her atmospheric monitoring equipment while coordinating electromagnetic warfare with precision that would have been impossible just weeks earlier. The weather girl, who'd been dismissed as just a meteorologist, was now commanding a multi-team operation designed to counter a threat that traditional military doctrine had never anticipated. The next 10 minutes would determine whether atmospheric warfare could be successfully countered or whether weather would become the ultimate strategic weapon. Lightning Team, execute electromagnetic pulse, mark. Jessica's voice cut through the tension in the underground command center as she initiated the most critical atmospheric warfare operation in military history. On her screens, electromagnetic energy erupted from the first position, sending precisely calculated interference patterns racing toward the enemy's weather modification installations. Lightning Team, pulse away. Clean activation, came Captain Martinez's voice through the secure communication link. Jessica monitored ionospheric readings while counting down the 15-second interval. The electromagnetic pulse from Lightning Team was propagating through the atmosphere exactly as her models had predicted. But the enemy installations were responding faster than expected, attempting to compensate for the interference. Thunder Team, execute electromagnetic pulse, mark. The second pulse launched, and Jessica watched atmospheric data streams showing electromagnetic interference patterns beginning to intersect. Her calculations had predicted that overlapping interference would create cascade disruption effects. But the real-time data was showing variations she hadn't anticipated. Dr. Thompson, the enemy installations are adapting their frequency output to compensate for our interference, Jessica announced while monitoring enemy electromagnetic signatures. They're not just passively receiving our countermeasures. They're actively adjusting their ionospheric heating patterns. That means they have automated compensation protocols, Dr. Thompson replied, his voice tight with concern. Their weather modification technology is more sophisticated than we estimated. Jessica felt a moment of doubt as she realized their electromagnetic countermeasures were facing an adaptive enemy system rather than static weather modification equipment. But her atmospheric models had included variables for compensation attempts, and she'd calculated backup interference patterns for exactly this scenario. Storm Team, execute electromagnetic pulse, mark. The third pulse activated, and Jessica immediately began implementing her adaptive countermeasures. All teams, this is Met Command. Enemy installations are showing compensation behavior. Implementing variable frequency protocol. Instead of maintaining steady electromagnetic interference, Jessica began coordinating variable frequency pulses designed to overwhelm adaptive compensation systems. The technique required real-time calculation of frequency changes based on enemy responses, turning the electromagnetic warfare operation into a dynamic battle between competing atmospheric control systems. Hurricane Team, execute variable frequency pulse pattern alpha, mark. Jessica's fingers flew across her atmospheric computers, calculating frequency variations in real time while monitoring enemy installation responses. The ionospheric heating patterns were becoming chaotic as enemy systems struggled to maintain coordination while adapting to constantly changing electromagnetic interference. Met Command, this is the Lightning Team. We're observing visible atmospheric disturbances at the enemy installation location. Electromagnetic heating patterns are destabilizing. Through satellite feeds, Jessica could see the first signs that their countermeasures were achieving partial success. Artificial cloud formations around enemy installations were dissipating, and electromagnetic heating patterns were losing coherence. but 3 installations were still maintaining partial coordination. Tornado Team, execute pulse pattern beta, mark. The 5th electromagnetic pulse activated, and Jessica saw cascade failure beginning at 2 additional enemy installations. Ionospheric heating was becoming unstable as electromagnetic interference overwhelmed their coordination protocols. But the mathematical precision of her operation was being tested by enemy adaptive responses that pushed her atmospheric models to their limits. Dr. Kim, what's the status of enemy ground force movement? Jessica, satellite imagery shows mechanized units accelerating toward assault positions. They're trying to begin their attack before losing complete weather modification support. Jessica realized that partial success wasn't sufficient. The enemy was adapting their timeline to exploit whatever atmospheric advantages remained available. Even degraded weather modification capability could provide tactical benefits for ground assault operations. Cyclone Team, execute pulse pattern gamma, mark. The final electromagnetic pulse activated, and Jessica coordinated all 6 interference sources into a synchronized pattern, designed to create electromagnetic chaos across the entire enemy weather modification network. Her atmospheric computers showed ionospheric conditions approaching cascade failure thresholds. All teams, this is Met Command. Initiating synchronized interference convergence. Maintain pulse patterns for 60 seconds. Jessica watched her monitors as electromagnetic interference from 6 positions converged on the enemy installations with mathematical precision. Ionospheric heating patterns collapsed, artificial atmospheric disturbances dissipated, and weather modification coordination systems experienced complete failure. Met Command, this is the Lightning Team. Enemy installation Alpha showing complete. Electromagnetic shutdown. No ionospheric heating detected. Met Command, this is Thunder Team. Installation Bravo has ceased all electromagnetic output. Weapons free. One by one, the reports came in confirming that electromagnetic countermeasures had successfully disrupted the enemy weather modification network. But Jessica's atmospheric monitoring was detecting something that made her blood run cold. Dr. Thompson, I'm reading residual ionospheric instability from the electromagnetic cascade. The disruption is creating uncontrolled atmospheric effects. The electromagnetic interference that had successfully disabled enemy weather modification was generating atmospheric disturbances that could threaten both enemy and friendly operations. Ionospheric instability was creating pressure systems, electromagnetic anomalies, and atmospheric conditions that were beyond anyone's control. Jessica, uncontrolled ionospheric disturbance could generate severe weather across the entire region. Dr. Thompson warned, we may have prevented enemy weather control, but we've created natural atmospheric chaos. Jessica faced a crisis that her atmospheric models hadn't fully anticipated. Successful electromagnetic countermeasures against weather modification technology were creating atmospheric instability that could be more dangerous than the original enemy threat. All teams, this is Met Command. Cease electromagnetic pulse generation immediately. We're creating atmospheric cascade effects. But even as the teams stopped their interference operations, Jessica's monitors showed that ionospheric instability was continuing to propagate. The electromagnetic disruption had triggered natural atmospheric responses that were generating severe weather systems across the region. Dr. Kim, satellite imagery shows storm system development over enemy ground, force positions, and approaching our base location. Jessica realized that their successful countermeasures had created an uncontrolled weather situation that threatened everyone in the region. She needed to find a way to stabilize atmospheric conditions before natural weather chaos created casualties. On both sides, Dr. Thompson, can we use controlled electromagnetic pulses to stabilize ionospheric activity? Theoretically possible, but it would require precise frequency modulation to calm atmospheric disturbances rather than disrupt them. Jessica began calculating atmospheric stabilization protocols while monitoring severe weather development across the region. Her expertise in meteorological warfare was now required to solve a problem that her own successful operation had created. All teams, this is Met Command. Stand by for atmospheric stabilization protocol. We're going to use controlled electromagnetic pulses to calm ionospheric disturbances. Major Davis interrupted with tactical updates from his observation posts. Lieutenant Morgan, enemy ground forces are taking shelter from severe weather generated by atmospheric instability. Their assault has been postponed due to hazardous conditions. Jessica felt grim satisfaction that enemy operations had been disrupted, but the uncontrolled weather was also threatening friendly positions. Storm systems were approaching Phoebe Sentinel with wind speeds and electromagnetic activity that could damage base infrastructure and ground aircraft. Lightning Team, prepare for atmospheric stabilization pulse at frequency 7.83 Hz. This frequency should resonate with natural ionospheric patterns and help stabilize atmospheric disturbances. Jessica coordinated electromagnetic pulse generation at frequencies designed to work with natural atmospheric systems rather than against them. The technique required understanding ionospheric resonance patterns and atmospheric stabilization, theory that pushed her meteorological knowledge to its absolute limits. Lightning Team, execute stabilization pulse. Mark. The controlled electromagnetic pulse propagated through the disturbed ionosphere, and Jessica watched atmospheric data, showing gradual stabilization beginning. Pressure systems were moderating, wind patterns were becoming more stable, and electromagnetic anomalies were decreasing. Thunder Team, execute stabilization pulse. Mark. Each stabilization pulse helped calm atmospheric disturbances, and Jessica coordinated the operation with the precision of a surgeon performing delicate atmospheric surgery. Too much electromagnetic energy would worsen the instability. Too little would be ineffective. Met Command, this is Dr. Thompson. Ionospheric disturbances are responding to stabilization pulses. Atmospheric conditions are approaching normal parameters. Jessica continued coordinating stabilization operations while monitoring weather conditions across the region. The severe storm systems were weakening, electromagnetic anomalies were diminishing, and natural atmospheric patterns were beginning to reassert themselves. All teams, this is Met Command. Atmospheric stabilization was successful. Enemy weather modification network disabled, ionospheric disturbances controlled, and natural weather patterns restored. Major Davis provided the final tactical assessment. Lieutenant Morgan, enemy ground forces are withdrawing to defensive positions. Without weather modification support, they're unable to maintain their assault timeline. Jessica felt exhaustion and triumph in equal measure as she realized that their electromagnetic countermeasures had achieved complete success. Enemy weather modification capability had been neutralized, atmospheric warfare had been prevented, and natural weather patterns had been restored across the region. Base Command, this is Met Command. Enemy atmospheric warfare capability neutralized. Threat level reduced to conventional military operations. Weather modification network permanently disabled. Colonel Martinez's voice came through the communication system with obvious relief. Outstanding work, Lieutenant Morgan. Your atmospheric analysis and electromagnetic countermeasures prevented a revolutionary warfare capability from being deployed successfully. As teams began returning to base and equipment was secured, Jessica realized that she had coordinated the most complex meteorological operation in military history. Her expertise in atmospheric science had been essential for countering a threat that traditional military capabilities couldn't address. The weather girl who'd been dismissed as providing routine forecasts had become the coordinator of atmospheric warfare countermeasures that had prevented enemy forces from weaponizing the sky itself. But as Jessica reviewed the operation's success, she understood that atmospheric warfare was no longer theoretical. Enemy forces had deployed operational weather modification technology, and only her mathematical precision and electromagnetic countermeasures had prevented them from achieving tactical weather control. The age of atmospheric warfare had begun, and meteorological expertise had become a critical military capability. The Pentagon briefing room fell silent as Jessica concluded her presentation to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. 3 weeks had passed since the atmospheric warfare operation, and her comprehensive analysis of weather modification threats had brought her to the highest levels of military leadership. The woman who had once been dismissed as just a weather girl now stood before the most senior officers in the American military, briefing them on a revolutionary form of warfare that could change global military strategy. "Lieutenant Morgan," said General Patricia Walsh, who was now chairing the newly formed Atmospheric Warfare Defense Committee, "your operational success at Phobe Sentinel has demonstrated that weather modification represents a fundamental shift in military capabilities. We need your assessment of the broader implications." Jessica activated her final slide, showing global atmospheric monitoring data that revealed weather modification activities across multiple continents. "In general, our analysis indicates that atmospheric warfare technology is being developed and deployed by at least 6 different military organizations worldwide. The operation at Phobe Sentinel was not an isolated incident. It was part of a coordinated research and development effort to weaponize meteorological science." The Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Robert Harrison, leaned forward with intense interest. "Lieutenant, you're saying that multiple nations are developing weather control capabilities?" "Yes, sir. Atmospheric manipulation technology has evolved beyond experimental research into operational military capability. The electromagnetic signatures we've detected match ionospheric heating installations in Russia, China, and several smaller nations with advanced atmospheric research programs." Jessica had spent the past 3 weeks analyzing global meteorological data with resources that had been unavailable during her deployment to Afghanistan. Satellite monitoring systems, international atmospheric databases, and classified intelligence. Reports had revealed that weather modification technology was becoming a strategic military priority for nations seeking asymmetric warfare advantages. "The tactical implications are significant," Jessica continued. "Weather modification allows smaller military forces to achieve strategic advantages against technologically superior opponents. Atmospheric warfare can neutralize air superiority, disrupt communication systems, and create tactical conditions that favor guerrilla operations over conventional military responses." General Martinez, who had been promoted following the successful operation at Phobe Sentinel, added strategic context. "The Joint Chiefs need to understand that Lieutenant Morgan's expertise represents a new military specialty. Atmospheric warfare requires meteorological knowledge that traditional military training doesn't provide." Jessica felt the weight of recognition that had been building since returning from Afghanistan. Her success in countering weather modification attacks had led to rapid promotion, assignment to the Pentagon's Atmospheric Warfare Division, and responsibility for developing defensive strategies against meteorological threats that most military officers didn't yet understand. "Lieutenant Morgan," said the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, "we're establishing a new military occupational specialty for atmospheric warfare analysts. We want you to develop the training curriculum and lead the program." The offer represented everything Jessica had worked toward since joining the military, but it also carried responsibilities that extended far beyond meteorological forecasting. Atmospheric warfare analysis would require understanding ionospheric physics, electromagnetic pulse generation, weather modification technology, and tactical applications of meteorological science. "Sir, I accept the assignment, but atmospheric warfare defense will require more than analyst training. We need operational capabilities for real-time atmospheric monitoring, electromagnetic countermeasures, and coordination with Special Operations Forces. Approved. You'll have funding for equipment, personnel, and research facilities. The Atmospheric Warfare Defense Division will be under your operational command. Jessica felt a mixture of pride and apprehension as she realized that her career had transformed completely. 6 months earlier, she had been providing routine weather forecasts at a forward operating base. Now she was being asked to create an entirely new military capability based on her expertise in atmospheric science. After the briefing, Jessica found herself in conversation with Dr. Thompson and Dr. Kim, who had also been assigned to the Atmospheric Warfare Program. The successful operation at Phoebe Sentinel had demonstrated that meteorological expertise was essential for national security, and the military was rapidly building capabilities to address atmospheric threats. Jessica, Dr. Thompson said as they reviewed their new research facility, "You've created a military specialty that didn't exist 6 months ago. Atmospheric warfare analysis is now considered as important as electronic warfare or cyber operations." The research facility was impressive by any standard. Advanced atmospheric monitoring equipment, electromagnetic pulse generators, ionospheric modeling computers, and satellite communication systems that could coordinate countermeasures across global distances. Jessica's meteorological station at Phoebe Sentinel had been transformed into a strategic military capability. Dr. Thompson, the challenge is training military personnel to understand atmospheric science at an operational level. Weather modification technology is advancing faster than our ability to develop countermeasures. Dr. Kim was reviewing intelligence reports about global weather modification activities. "Jessica, look at this data from our European monitoring stations. Electromagnetic signatures indicate that atmospheric manipulation technology is being tested across multiple time zones with coordination that suggests international cooperation." The intelligence was troubling. Weather modification was evolving from isolated national research programs into coordinated international efforts to develop atmospheric warfare capabilities. Countries that lacked advanced air forces or naval capabilities were investing in weather control technology as a strategic equalizer. Dr. Kim coordinates with international monitoring stations to establish global atmospheric surveillance networks. "We need early warning capabilities for weather modification activities anywhere in the world." Jessica's responsibilities were expanding beyond American military operations to global atmospheric security. Weather modification technology could affect international stability, create humanitarian crises, and destabilize regions through artificially generated climate disasters. 3 months later, Jessica stood in the Situation Room at the White House, briefing the president on atmospheric warfare threats that required national security attention at the highest levels of government. Her analysis had identified weather modification activities that pose direct threats to American interests and international stability. "Madam President," Jessica began, "atmospheric warfare represents a strategic threat that transcends traditional military boundaries. Weather modification technology can affect agricultural production, disrupt transportation systems, and create humanitarian emergencies that destabilize entire regions." The president studied satellite imagery showing suspicious atmospheric activities across multiple continents. "Lieutenant Colonel Morgan, what are the policy implications of these atmospheric warfare capabilities?" Jessica had been promoted twice in 6 months, reflecting the military's recognition that atmospheric expertise was essential for national security. Her analysis was now influencing international policy discussions about weather modification, technology, and atmospheric warfare treaties. "Madam President, we need international agreements governing weather modification technology, similar to treaties that control chemical and biological weapons." Atmospheric warfare could create environmental disasters that affect multiple nations regardless of political boundaries. The President's National Security Advisor added political context. Lieutenant Colonel, atmospheric warfare capabilities are being developed by nations that view weather control as a strategic advantage against superior military forces. Traditional deterrent strategies may not be effective against atmospheric threats. Jessica had been studying this problem since establishing the Atmospheric Warfare Defense Division. Weather modification technology created strategic capabilities that traditional military doctrine hadn't anticipated. Nations could conduct atmospheric attacks that appeared to be natural disasters, making attribution and response extremely difficult. Madam President, atmospheric warfare requires new categories of international law and military response protocols. Weather modification attacks could be conducted without obvious attribution, creating plausible deniability for aggressor nations. The briefing concluded with presidential authorization for expanded atmospheric monitoring and international cooperation on weather modification defense. Jessica's expertise had become essential for national security policy at the highest levels of government. 6 months after returning from Afghanistan, Jessica found herself addressing the United Nations Security Council about atmospheric warfare, threats that required international cooperation to address effectively. Her transformation from dismissed weather forecaster to internationally recognized expert in atmospheric warfare demonstrated how technical expertise could evolve into strategic military capability. Members of the Security Council, Jessica said, addressing representatives from nations around the world, atmospheric warfare technology poses threats that transcend national boundaries. Weather modification attacks could affect multiple countries simultaneously, creating humanitarian crises and environmental disasters that require coordinated international response. The UN presentation represented the culmination of Jessica's evolution from meteorological technician to strategic analyst whose expertise influenced global security policy. Her success in countering weather modification attacks had demonstrated that atmospheric science was essential for international stability. After the UN session, Jessica reflected on the dramatic transformation her career had undergone. The officers, who had once dismissed her as just a weather girl, now sought her analysis for strategic planning at the highest levels of military and political leadership. But her success had also revealed the complexity of atmospheric warfare threats that were evolving faster than defensive capabilities. Weather modification technology was advancing rapidly, and nations were developing atmospheric weapons that could create strategic advantages without traditional military engagement. Jessica's final responsibility was establishing training programs that would prepare the next generation of atmospheric warfare analysts. Her expertise needed to be shared with military personnel who would face atmospheric threats that traditional training hadn't prepared them to understand. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jessica said, addressing the first class of atmospheric warfare analysts at the newly established National Atmospheric Defense Academy, weather is no longer just about predicting rain or sunshine. Atmospheric science has become a strategic military capability that affects national security at the highest levels. The students represented a new military specialty that Jessica had created through her operational success and strategic analysis. Atmospheric warfare analysts would become as essential as pilots, intelligence officers, and special operations personnel for defending against threats that could control the sky itself. Jessica's transformation was complete. The woman who had been underestimated and dismissed had become the founder of an entirely new military capability. Her expertise in atmospheric science had evolved into strategic leadership that influenced international security policy and military doctrine. But as she looked toward the future, Jessica understood that atmospheric warfare was only beginning. Weather modification technology would continue advancing, and new threats would emerge that would require continued innovation and expertise to counter effectively. The age of atmospheric warfare had arrived, and Jessica Morgan had become its most important defender. The Weather Girl had saved the world from a revolutionary threat that most people still didn't understand. Her legacy would be measured not just in military success, but in the atmospheric security that protected nations from weather-based attacks. That could have changed the course of human history. From routine weather forecasting to global atmospheric defense, Jessica's journey proved that technical expertise, when combined with courage and determination, could transform individual capability into strategic military advantage. The sky itself had become a battlefield, and she had learned to defend it with mathematical precision and meteorological mastery that had once been dismissed as merely predicting tomorrow's weather. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.